They look like big, good, strong hands. This line, said by a mournful rock-biter in the never-ending story, has stayed with me since I was a child. Despite his enormous rock hands, he was unable to protect his friends from the nothing. They slipped through his grasp. He simply couldn't keep them from suffering. Christian theological accounts of suffering seemingly outnumber the stars. Questions of whether God allows, causes, could stop, or potentially does stop evil, catastrophe, and suffering are the kinds of questions which plague people at all levels of religious involvement. Few in the midst of tragedy are immune from wondering why God didn't stop that which has brought their present sufferings. My guest today is asking, what if God can't stop it? What if God wants suffering to cease, wants to stop evil, but cannot unilaterally stop evil, tragedy, and catastrophe? Now, not because of forces outside of God, like the nothing ripping apart the seemingly strong hands of Rockbiter, but because of God's very nature, God's very loving nature. My name is Liam Miller, and this week on Love, Rinse, Repeat, I speak with Thomas Jay Oord about his new book, God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Suffering. We talk about God, evil, love, suffering, climate change, the pastoral concerns behind the book, and since this is Thomas's third visit to Love, Rinse, Repeat, I play the grand inquisitor, as it were, and throw some even tougher questions his way. Thomas, as he comes from the green room and grabs a chair in the Love, Rinse, Repeat studio, offers thoughtful and wonderful responses to all these questions. But I thought I should set the mood with the two big assumptions undergirding his work. God always loves, and evil is real. Welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Well, Thomas Jay Oord, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Yeah, it's good to be speaking with you.
Yeah, I'm very excited. This is our first time we've done an interview for the podcast, but we've done 2 interviews for the YouTube channel previously. So third time's a charm.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting me.
That's all right. So just before we get into our main topic today, which is your new book, God Can't, we're in Advent season. We're coming close to Christmas. So I thought we could do a couple of Christmassy questions to begin with, just to warm up and get us there. So I guess if you have either a favorite or both, a favorite Christmas film or favorite Christmas song, what's that going to be?
Oh, probably film, a really old film called The Fourth Wise Man.
Mm-hmm.
I won't describe it. I encourage your listeners to go back way in the archives and check out this book called The Fourth Wise Man.
Okay, that's a good one. All right, and then I guess if anyone's listening to this, preachers, ministers listening to this, they're getting ready for their Christmas services. So I guess maybe from your own experience, either what are the things to avoid or what are the things to do well at a Christmas, Christmas Day sermon? What's your advice for the Christmas Day sermon?
My first piece of advice is keep it very short. Probably my second piece of advice is try not to give the impression that the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ was the first time God was present in the world. Sometimes I go to a Christmas service and I hear pastors preaching and they give the impression that, until Jesus came around, God was just totally uninvolved. I recommend people choose their language carefully.
Yeah, that's very good. All right. So let's get on to God Can't. Let's move into this direction of the book. So you've been exploring kind of the idea of an uncontrolling God and the nature of God's love for a while now. Like, as I mentioned before, we talked about your earlier book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. And here you're continuing to kind of push and develop it with God Can't. So I guess what led to this quest, this search to begin with, and what's kind of still sustaining it and drawing you into exploring it further as your work develops?
Yeah, I think I've been wrestling with this question for probably at least since junior high. I mean, since I was a teenager, because it involves some of the most central questions we ask about God. That is, how God acts, what kind of power God has. If God is loving, what does that mean? As well as what we experience in life, the joys, but also the sorrows, the love, but also the evil. And so I think I've been toying with this since I was a kid, and over the years, formulating answers that seem more or less plausible, and then trying to address, loose ends here and there, or the implications of these kinds of views. When I wrote The Uncontrolling Love of God a few years ago, it was a really important experience for me on a number of levels. First of all, it was a book that was published in an academic press, but I tried really hard to write in a way that was pretty accessible. And because of that, I got lots and lots of letters, emails, Facebook messages from people who have been hurt or been abused or suffered some tragedy. And many of them, were very complimentary to me for that book, because it helped them understand God in a way that made it the case they didn't have to blame God for what happened, or blame God for not intervening to stop what happened to them. And one of my friends I was talking to her about this whole experience and how grateful I was to be getting these kinds of letters. And she said, you ought to write a book that more people can understand. You ought to write a book for a wider audience, the public, that isn't an academic book, that includes a bunch of these stories as illustrations of the ideas in The Uncontrolling Love of God. So this new book, God Can't, is really written for a wide audience. It has some new ideas in them that aren't in The Uncontrolling Love of God, but it takes the main theme from that book and makes it, I think, more accessible.
Yeah, and I really feel that comes through as you're reading it. Like, it is a widely accessible book and is very personal and very pastoral. And I think, as you say, you were writing this based on responses you were getting from the book and in a desire to meet the pastoral needs of people. So I guess, how did that shape both how you approach the writing and then how you also structure the book itself? How did that kind of influence the process?
Yeah, I approached it, and actually here I have to give a lot of credit to my wife. She said, look, you've got to write a book that I will like to read. And that means, give me lots of illustrations, give me lots of stories, help me see the connections, paint pictures with your words. I tried to do that. I'm not always successful in this book, but I tried to write so that I'll give a section that's, more theory, and then the next section kind of show how that works out in practical life, or add a story, or bring in a popular book like The Shack, or a movie, or something that either illustrates it or I can use as a foil to something I think is the wrong way to think. And in fact, this is again my wife encouraging me. She says, Tom, you need to tell some of your own story, which I tell a little bit of that in the book. Not, it's not the main part of the book. But I think she's right. It helps people connect to the ideas and to me as an author.
And it raises up, you kind of, as you're going along, you're able to kind of, because you're talking with these stories that happen and with people's own experience, you're able to kind of address, often what are the common things that we hear that are unhelpful, the things that we think that, so almost as people's potential objections might be coming up, or potential, even not objection, just like, whoa, that freaks me out. You're like, let's address that and then move to that, and then from that to something else, and kind of it builds in a very nice way.
Well, thank you. I tried to think of it kind of like a conversation, and at times I tried to imagine what people might say in response to me if they were, across the table from me.
And I think also what's very important is the book isn't just a like a deconstruction of another model. Like, you've offered these kind of 5 very positive beliefs that shape the book. That so here is something you can grab onto. It's not just like, hey, that other thing's bad. It's offering that, because otherwise you just left people within their pain and with no constructive way forward.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the idea that God can't stop evil single-handedly is a really important idea, but that alone isn't very satisfying, because we also want to know, is God going to help out here? Is God going to heal? What role do I have to play? All those kinds of questions.
Yeah. Well, let's get a little more into some specifics of the book. I guess there's some big concepts to kind of tackle right away, just even in just a very small, brief way, but just because I think understanding how you conceive them is essential to a proper reading of your argument and the solution you're offering. So I guess as brief as you can, like tweetable if ideally, is what is evil and what is love?
A genuinely evil event is any event that, all things considered, makes the world worse than it might have been. Love involves acting intentionally in response to others and in response to God to promote overall well-being. Is that tweetable?
They're great. I reckon with the 280 characters, we get both of them in. That's perfect. You don't even have to thread. Great. So that's there, and that will kind of come out more, I'm sure, as we move forward. So another concept worth exploring is God's power, because I think as people might hear the comment made before that God can't single-handedly prevent evil, it's like, oh, okay, well, God isn't powerful. God can't be almighty. But you challenge that a God who can't prevent evil is still powerful. You're right. So I guess how do you understand and reconfigure power in light of this claim that God can't single-handedly stop evil?
Yeah, what I try to do is focus in on what I think is the problematic view of power. And that's the idea that God, as one actor, could control another person, another being, a circumstance. I use this word single-handedly control. In other words, God is the only force or power at work. And if that's the case, that God alone can produce certain results or determine certain outcomes, then we have a really hard time not blaming God for either causing evil or failing to prevent that evil. I do think God is almighty in the sense of being the mightiest of all others, exerting might upon all others, and being the source of might for all others. And I think that sense of almighty makes God the mightiest being in the universe. But even the mightiest being in the universe, as I see it, cannot control anyone or anything entirely.
I'm just thinking about how, because a lot of way models of power, thoughts of power are developed in the human realm, in politics or things like that, derive from a particular view of God's power as well, and then just extend that over into the human realm. And I know with like community organizing and those kind of groups, there's talk of like there's good power and bad power. Like we don't want to dismiss power, because like people power can be a good, positive thing. So I wonder if you thoughts on how, as you reorient this understanding of power in a kind of non-coercive way, how that maybe then translates to how we think about power in more human spheres.
Yeah, I think the most powerful people in the universe, I won't say universe, I've never been to all the places. The most powerful people in the world or in history are powerful because they influence others to act in certain ways. And that can be for good or ill. Take Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa, two incredibly powerful people. Now, both of them, if you took them to the Olympics and asked them to compete in a powerlifting contest, they would not do well at all. They're not physically powerful, but they were able to influence people in positive or negative ways. Now, I think God is the most powerful, and I think God is always loving, so God is always influencing others in positive ways, not negative ways. But if we think about that in terms of community organizing or pastoral ministry or even political kinds of leadership, we should think about ways in which we are influential in other people's lives, not so much in terms of how we impact them, but how we motivate them to use their influence more widely. So the most influential people in the world aren't the most physically strong. They're the people who can persuade, call, command, incite, in some way influence others for them to then influence others, and it then begins to multiply.
Mm. So I think what kind of ties in with this power discussion is what you said in there. God is always loving,
Right.
which leads to that no limitation is placed on God from outside of God, but by God's nature
Correct.
places a limit. Because God is loving, that means God can't go against lovingness.
Right.
So, as you write, God can't oppose God's nature. And in some ways, I was thinking about the way this argument in the book moves into kind of a very kind of classical theological discussion about kind of God's aseity and God's attributes. Like the idea that God doesn't use power, God is power. God doesn't extend love, God is love. Like these kind of things that there's no... So I was just wondering about God just is the very attributes of God. So I was wondering how your picture of God, I guess, either intersects or departs from this kind of discussion that's, been around for a while now.
Yeah, there's some similarities and some differences. This word aseity is interpreted various ways. At its very basic notion is that God is necessary. God doesn't require something outside of God's self in order to exist. And I affirm the necessary existence of God. Typically tied very closely to that is the traditional view of divine simplicity. And that says that God doesn't have multiple parts. God is one. And I affirm that as well. But when we begin to talk about God's attributes, we're not talking about things that are in God. They're not parts of God. Rather, they're logical abstractions or characteristics of God. And so you can think of God's multiple characteristics and still think that God is, necessary and one or simple. What makes my particular view unique is that I say that within this collection of attributes of God's nature, this self-giving, others-empowering love comes logically first. And by that, I don't mean that there's sort of a lineup of things in God's nature. I mean that logically speaking, we ought to understand God's other attributes in the light of love. So that if we, for instance, think that, here's a really good one. If you have power first in God's nature, you might think that God actually has the power to choose to do evil if God wanted to. Because I have love coming first, and since love is the thing that we understand power in light of, I don't think God even has the power to choose to do evil, because love makes it the case that love shapes and governs what God can do. And then I add to that the notion that this love is self-giving and others empowering, which is generative, which is creative. And because God necessarily does that, God just simply can't control others to whom God gives freedom or agency or self-organization or just the very possibility for existence.
That's really good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So as we're thinking about love, I think a really touching part of your book explores the idea of feeling God's love. So, because I think, again, people might be like, oh, a God who can't control, like, might start to be, well, that's distant. Like, distance might start to come into that mind. But you're saying God is, as you said about your Christmas sermon, God's being present and always present and present to everyone in every moment.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the importance of the felt love to your overall project, and perhaps a little talk on practices that either you engage with or you're seeing people engage with to help feel that love?
Yeah, most Christians throughout the ages have felt that God is affected by what they do. In fact, God even has emotions. It's hard to read the Bible and take it straightforwardly, seriously, and think that the people in the Bible were not talking about God as emotional, because God is described as affected by what we do. And yet, most of the formal technical theologies in Christian history have said that God is unaffected, is impassible, that God doesn't have feelings. And they've said that because they've begun with a particular understanding of perfection. They've said that, God is perfect. I believe that God is perfect too. They said that any change in a perfect being could only be change from what is perfect to what is imperfect. And since God's perfect, God can't change. Since God can't change, God must not be affected by what we do. Therefore, God doesn't feel any of what we do in the world. And all the descriptions of God as having such in the Bible are just anthropomorphic projections. Well, I think they've got it wrong, or at least half wrong. I think God's nature is unchanging, and we can count on that to be the same today, yesterday, and forever. But God is an experiencing being. God is the living Lord of history. And this experience really is affected by what goes on in the world. And so God is passible. God is mutable. But God's nature is impassible and immutable. And this is, I think, important when we think about suffering, and important when we think about whether or not we ever feel we're loved by God. First of all, it's important because if God suffers, then God can then feel some of what we feel. We have a fellow sufferer who understands, to use a famous line. But also, as I point out in the book, and as you allude to, there are times when many of us believe we feel God's love for us. And that can come in a variety of settings. Sometimes it happens to me when I'm walking in nature and something powerful happens. Occasionally it happens to me when I'm in church. There have been situations in my life in which I've been with my family and had this extremely warm feeling that God loves me too. But other people feel it in therapy sessions, or when they're watching movies or listening to a great piece of music. There's lots of different ways in which this kind of feeling loved by God can be manifest. Not everybody feels it all the time, but some people feel it some of the time.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. So one of the biggest threats to the well-being, not only of the human person, the human race, but to all creatures is climate change, is the ongoing ecological crisis. And you write about how God, yes, gives agency to humans and other complex creatures, but also to less complex creatures like organisms and cells. And you talk about how God is present to all. Again, not just to us, but present always to all.
Right.
So I guess, how does your work, shape your thinking around the ecological crisis and to, I guess, to the human commission to follow God's creative and caring work for the earth and all it brings forth?
Yeah, awesome question. I have in mind to write a book on this particular subject. And at the heart of that book is going to be some of the same claims I make in this book, including the idea that God simply can't fix the ecological crisis all by God's self. God can't fix it single-handedly. But part of my impetus and part of my motivation for thinking carefully about God's love for, we'll call them the non-human creation, is that I think non-human creation has intrinsic value. That is, it's not valuable only for what it can do for us. It's also valuable for what it can do for itself and how it can enjoy values in life. And I'm even willing to extend that value experiencing down to the smallest levels of reality. I'm attracted to a set of views that are sometimes called pan-experientialism or panpsychism. I don't use that language as much as some people do, but the notion that all of reality has this experiencing capacity, and that God's love not only is extended to those of us who have complex experiencing capacities, but even to those creatures who have less complex and the simplest entities of reality. That means not only that we have a role to play in responding to climate change, but God cares for and wants to redeem all of creation. I find that a beautiful vision.
That's really great, and kind of leads a bit into how you talk about how God can squeeze good from bad. So this is very much differentiated from the idea that God is allowing bad to happen so that good will come out of it, right? You know, I suffer so I can mature, or a child suffers so that we all care for our children better, like whatever, like this kind of, but it's definitely differentiating from that. And I was thinking as I was reading it about how the story of Joseph came to mind, because Joseph doesn't seem to be, he's not a victim of a divine plan or a test, you know, maybe the Job story is set up, but of like human sin. His brothers make direct choices to, you know, kill him and then decide to sell him off to slavery, and maybe his own arrogance and telling them they'll all bow down to him is partly responsible. You know, let's put that out there. But, you know, in the end of the narrative, it's, you know, where God is barely rated a mention throughout this, you know, almost 25 chapter story or something like that. Joseph looks at the past and he goes, God was working in this, that even though, you know, this, God was working ahead, and now many people will be saved because of the situation I've found myself in. But it's interesting that, like, it's Joseph is the one kind of doing this interpretive work, you know, again, compared to Job, where it's his friends show up and go, hey, this is what's happening, Job. This is and you know, and so I was thinking about that in the sense of the way this seeing God squeezing good out of it is our kind of a work we do ourselves, perhaps with the help of the signs and narratives of the scriptures and we're within Christian community, but it's work we do. I don't know, what were your thoughts on this idea in general, if anything you want to share with us, and also the way these kind of biblical narratives shape that idea?
Yeah, I like the way you talk about this. I think ultimately what we're wrestling with is, how do we interpret the history that's come before? You know, the classic line in that particular story of Joseph is when Joseph looks at his brothers and he says something like, you intended this for my harm, but God intended it or wanted it or allowed it or used it for my good. Now, I threw those four possibilities in there because those all have interpretive sort of frameworks around them. If you think when Joseph is saying this that he's believing that God allowed it for good, that's kind of suggesting that all of these crappy things that happened, even the deaths of many people through famine, were somehow foreordained and planned by God. That is not a view I find appealing at all. But if you read that same story and see and interpret those passages as saying that God used these things for good, even though God didn't want them in the first place, then you're putting a different interpretive framework on what happened in history. And I think, you know, you and I do this all the time. I don't know about the church that you go to, or the church at least I grew up in. People would oftentimes give a testimony. And they would talk about some horrible things or some difficult times, or they've gone through financial pressures, or somebody died, or somebody was sick. And then they would place an interpretive framework on it. And oftentimes that framework was one I found unsatisfying, because oftentimes they would say, you know, God gave me this cancer, but, you know, I'm just stronger for it. Or they would look and they would say, you know, I had this accident last year, but I met my wife at the hospital and God gave me the accident so I could meet her, or whatever. And they give this framework that makes it sound as if God is the one who is manipulating and foreplanning everything. I think we can really affirm, accept, and appreciate the good that comes after evil without saying God planned it, caused it, allowed it in the first place. And so that's what that chapter is all about. God squeezes good from the evil God didn't want in the first place.
Which is I think it's a nice thing to believe. So you're kind of talking about how people have done this work and they're telling these stories, and that's how they put on, how they are interpreting it. And so, we've been talking earlier about the pastoral care, the pastoral element of God can't. So I guess it's interesting, as you're, if you've read this book and you're a person who cares for people, even if you're not in just a ministry, you just got a friend or a family member who's in a tough time. I guess, how do you begin to introduce this if it's going to be a very foreign, alien concept for someone? Because especially when someone's right in the depths of something horrible, going on, like a loss, a deep loss or something, it's a hard thing to kind of, maybe even the unhelpful image is the only thing kind of holding them together in this moment. But we're aware that maybe if they continue to hold it for too long after the immediate situation, it will become toxic in its own way. So I guess your thoughts on how to do the work of helping people to transform their view of God, when they in or just after those kind of more times of crisis.
Yeah, and let me begin with 3 very practical things. First of all, I think it's important to be present with those who are suffering. Second of all, I think it's important to listen carefully to what people say and how they're interpreting what's happening. Third, when people say something theologically that I disagree with, I don't just sort of shake my head and say, yep, you're right. I usually look at them, I smile, and then I respond with a way of talking about God that I can believe in that won't sound like I'm trying to correct them. So if they will say, maybe I'm in a situation in which someone's suffering greatly and they'll say, God's punishing me. I'm not going to shake my hand and say, yep, you deserve it. I'm going to look at them and I'm going to say, God's love endures forever and God cares for you. Now, they might, in their mind, realize that I'm not agreeing with them, but it's a way of affirming something I can believe in. Or maybe if someone is we're in the hospital and I'll just make up an imaginary situation. Let's say I'm visiting the hospital of a family whose son was just in a car wreck. And let's say the son had been drinking alcohol and was drunk. And I'm standing there at the bed and the father says, well, he deserves this. God just is punishing him for doing what he did there. God's going to teach him a lesson from this. I'm going to try to look at that person and say, a God of love does squeeze some good out of rotten situations. I'm so glad God is present here and there's second chances in this case, or something like that. So those are very practical kinds of ways. Pastorally, I try to deal with situations in which I encounter people who are suffering and who may have theological views that I don't find very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And to answer the question I didn't ask is, I guess, always better to try to deal with these things before they happen. So
sure.
Read God Can't and adjust your preaching and prayer.
Well,
catch on.
I really did try to write a book that you could give your friend, your neighbor, your parishioner, even your pastor, that they could read and actually understand, not some, sort of technical theology book. So hopefully this is that kind of book.
Yeah. So I guess I mentioned before, we've done interviews a few times now. So I want to use that trust to play something of the Grand Inquisitor and ask a few maybe more pointed questions, but I could see some maybe objections coming to people. And so I'll pose them and we'll see how we go.
Excellent.
If we're still friends at the end. So in the book, one of the things you kind of push back against or critique is the idea that people saying that suffering is a mystery. There's awful suffering. We just can't know. God's ways are not our ways. God's love is not our love. It's a mystery. And you're not satisfied with that kind of response.
No.
And you offer a very solution-based, this is the nature of God. This is God's relationship to suffering. This is God's relationship to evil and way he interacts with the world.
That's right. Yeah.
And I guess, aren't you building a box for God? Isn't mystery something that's just naturally part of the divine creature gap? Isn't mystery something that we look through a glass darkly? Isn't this a maybe more pastorally sensitive box building, but still a box building enterprise?
Yeah, that's an awesome objection / question. I want to begin by saying I don't have God figured out. I don't try to present in this book the way that I am certain things are. Rather, I'm presenting a proposal, a way of looking at God and the world. It's one that I find most satisfying. It's the one I think is most likely true, but I don't know with certainty. And so there's definitely lots of room for mystery at that level. The kind of mystery I don't like is when people are wrestling with this tough question, and when they realize that the answers that they have don't make a lot of sense, they just reach into their back pocket and pull out the mystery card and plop it on the table. And then there's nothing more you can really say because God's just a mystery and we can't understand God. So I'm all for mystery in the sense of, in humility, saying we see through a glass darkly, but I'm not for mystery if it becomes a way out when one is cornered in the midst of struggling through really difficult questions.
Okay, that's good. All right, so the second objection is we're in Advent, which is, I very much see it about looking forward to the ultimate coming of Christ to judge and make right, to bring the righteousness of God, to set all wrongs to right, and all these things. And for many who have, marginalized Christian communities, the belief that God will ultimately make right, that God has the power to overturn the wrongs of this world, so in people involved in civil rights struggles, in liberation struggles, we might not get there, our generation might not see it, but God's got this, God will put it to right. And that very, a strong view of God who can overturn the powers of darkness here in this world and cosmically is something that sustains a lot of people. So does this view, rob that kind of rock to grab onto by communities that are, oppressed historically and ongoingly and systematically?
Yeah, another great question. So it all depends on what we think is involved in God making things right. If what we're talking about is God working with creation in a love relationship, I'm on board with saying that. I don't think God will or even can do it single-handedly, but I think God's activity to make creation right, to redeem all creation, not only is happening in this life, but I believe in the afterlife, and that God continually does that, not only toward those who are saying yes to God now, but also to those who aren't saying yes to God now. So I don't have a God who decides to send everyone to hell forever who disagrees with him. I have a God who continues to reach out and call and present the options for love. If you think God could just single-handedly, through an act of fiat, to control, fix everything without, and that's your hope, that's what's going to happen at the end, that God's going to do it all alone, I would question your wisdom in doing anything about it right now. In other words, if you're an activist and you think God could fix it all alone, why screw around trying to fix it yourself? I mean, if that's really the way you think God acts, then what you do is really superfluous. It's really unnecessary. It's really just, God just sort of condescendingly saying, yeah, you can play in your corner, but I'm just going to fix it all in the end. I think activists ought to have a view like the one I'm presenting in this book, because it actually gives meaning to their deep intuitions that what they do really matters, that the activity they're doing has ultimate significance. So that's how I'd respond to that good question.
That's right. I also like just to take my inquisitor hat off for a second.
Okay.
Like your chapter on healing, which kind of did talk about healing happening beyond the mortal plane, like healing happening beyond our death, that healing is something that God is invested in, not just in this, but beyond. And I thought that was a really, a a really delightful insight in the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And that meshes with that last chapter when I try to talk about my relentless love view of the afterlife. But I hadn't really thought about it till you just mentioned that. So maybe I should have made that connection clearer.
No, now I'll haunt your sleep. Should have done. All right, my Inquisitor back on.
Okay.
You mentioned that Jesus is this picture of, you want to know what God looks like, we look to Jesus, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Christological statement. I mean, isn't the incarnation interventionist? Like, Jesus was, he stopped people from stoning a woman. He healed people. He flipped tables. He did very things that shaped the course of history. If that's what Jesus reveals God, doesn't that create a disconnect?
Yeah, another good question. You're a good inquisitor. But I've also been thinking about this, and I have an answer, at least that I find helpful.
Good.
I think Jesus reveals God's character, but Jesus had a localized physical body. And I think, along with the vast majority of the Christian tradition, that God is a universal, bodiless spirit, or incorporeal, or immaterial. And so when Jesus can flip tables or do those kinds of things with his body, God doesn't actually have a localized physical body to do those kinds of things. And I addressed this in one part of the first chapter. But maybe your question, your inquisitor question, has an even deeper issue, and that is the incarnation itself. If God has the ability to become incarnate, and what Jesus does reflects who God is, does this mean that God really does have the capacity to control things because God took control, or at least somehow controlled through this human Jesus? And here I would have to appeal to what most scholars call a spirit Christology, the idea that Jesus really did have freedom. The temptations of Jesus are real, that Jesus could have sinned had he freely chosen to do so, and that what makes him the revelation of God's character is that he chose to respond appropriately to the Holy Spirit's action in his life. And so what Jesus can do as an embodied historical person in Nazareth is different somewhat in what God can do as a bodiless spirit. And that's also why, I should add, why you and I can sometimes do things that God can't, because you and I have localized physical bodies. It doesn't make us stronger than God, but it does mean that because of who we are and the kinds of creatures we are, there's certain capacities that we can do straightforwardly that God can only do if God asks us to do them.
That's great. So you even asked yourself a tough question in there and nailed it. So that was like when, in the police in the scenes of interrogation in movies, and the person starts unwinding and giving up too much information.
I love it.
So let's go one final question. God needs our cooperation. That's the kind of the final main chapter in the book. So how does this belief that God needs our cooperation, I guess, affects the way you conceive of human dignity? Or to borrow a phrase of a book that we hope you'll outsell, a purpose-driven life.
I love it.
How does it affect the way we think of the human person, human dignity, and human purpose?
Yeah. I think God has general purposes for all creation, and then more specific purposes for each species, and even more specific purposes for each human or each individual in those species. But all of those purposes are not preordained or somehow laid down as a kind of blueprint, but they're general purposes, and they play out in the particularities of our moment-by-moment experience. So, for instance, I think one of God's purposes for me and my life is that I love my wife, Cheryl. That wasn't God's purpose for me when I was 15 years old, because I wasn't married to Cheryl back then. I didn't even know who she was. I don't think even God knew with certainty we were going to get married. So the kind of specific purposes God has emerge in the moment by moment concrete situations. But God has these general purposes that transcend all those concrete situations. And those are the ones that are sort of they're always there, but they get they take form in the particularities of our everyday lives.
That's excellent. And one of the purposes is go and order, God can't.
I'm sure that's been ordained from the foundation of the world.
Tom, how can people connect with you, connect with your work, stay in touch? What's the best way they can go about doing that?
Yeah, I have a website, thomasjayoord.com. And if you're really interested in getting some free stuff or information, you could sign up for my newsletter. This book, God Can't, is coming out in January of 2019, and it'll be available on Amazon in print version, electronic version. In fact, there's supposed to be a Spanish version coming out and an audio version. So all kinds of ways you could access this particular book.
Yeah, and Tom's really great at additional resources, like Uncontrollable Love of God has like a website with a whole series of essays of people reflecting on the book in different contexts and for different purposes. And God Can't has a resource section, and it has discussion questions. So it's going to be good if you ever wanted to do something with a Bible study or a discussion group, whatever you might have, or just for your own exploration. Yeah.
Thanks for adding those. Yeah, I should have said that. It's the kind of book that I hope can be used in classes or discussion groups.
And I'll also plug the newsletter because it has the best photos of any newsletter from a theologian you've ever received.
Oh, thanks, Liam.
No worries. Well, Thomas Jay Oord, thank you very much for coming on Love, Rinse, Repeat. It's been a blast.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me and for hosting an excellent conversation. I really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome.